There are over 4,000 religions existing in the world, and 85% of the world's people are considered to be believers. And through time and across the world, we have no knowledge of a society that doesn't have beliefs. It seems to be a natural characteristic, a product of our hugely inventive minds, that we communicate with beings and worlds beyond nature. As fully modern people, we go back 100,000 years, and certainly we recognize in the archaeological record from Africa and from Southeast Asia and Australasia, really ancient things that show the modern human species beginning to symbolize thoughts. The oldest object that we have, which shows us very clearly that we are having a conversation with something that does not exist in nature, is the figure of the Lion Man. The Lion Man is made of mammoth ivory. This is the biggest animal in the late Ice Age environment. The fiercest animal in the environment was the cave lion, bigger than a modern African lion, without a mane, a huge, fierce creature. What the sculptor who made the Lion Man has done is to combine the mammoth, the lion, and the human. So we have human legs and a groin, the navel in the correct place for a human being. And then as you come up the body, you come into these immensely broad and strong shoulders and a head, the head of a lion, made with such naturalism that we can see that he's watching, that he's listening. The little furrow behind his ear is the furrow created as the muscles tense for the ear to be turned and alert while listening. His eyes are looking forward and his mouth in this extraordinary grin. This combination of human and animal features, this alertness, this participation, suggests that there's a conversation going on here. A conversation of a human who is so much part of nature, but wears clothes, makes tools, has fire, but yet is in awe of this fierce lion from whom it's important to protect oneself, but also to admire. So this is a really important conversation happening here. Now, I can't say whether this sculpture represents an avatar or a deity or a creation story. None of that really matters. What matters is this conversation, this sign of mind, and this sign of using a belief in beings and worlds beyond nature that help us to get by, that help us to give us meaning and understanding and to overcome the things that frighten us, but also to share stories with one another around the fire. And we know this has happened with the Lion Man because his body is polished by the wear of being passed from hand to hand. And he's found in a cave, Stadel Cave, not far from Ulm in Baden-Württemberg. Deep in its recesses, the Lion Man was carefully put away after sharing stories around the fire, bonding, socializing, planning for tomorrow, thinking about the possibilities. So it shows beliefs in other worlds, in other beings, being a really important part for social cohesion and for confidence of human beings to have meaning and carry on with their lives. All cultures have creation stories, And in all of them, light has to be the first thing that is provided. For us, we know the stories of Genesis, let there be light, and there was light. But that story goes on in many other cultures, in many other beliefs. In the northwest coast of America, Native American peoples have a great tradition of the raven stealing the light. And it's a beautiful story, which is depicted here in an object made by Haida artist Preston Singletary. The story of the raven is rather wonderful. Forever, an old man and his daughter had existed in the dark in a house. And Raven, who had always been, was flying around in the dark. But he kept bumping into things, so he got a bit fed up. So he thought, well, he would go and see these people living in their house, their chum. So he transforms himself into a boy. And the old man treats him like his grandson. But really, Raven is having a look around to see what's in this house. And he sees a box, and he starts to look into the box, and the grandfather tells him off. So he waits until grandfather is not there. And he opens the box, and inside the box there is another box, and inside the box there is another box, to a tiny box in the middle. And when he opens the tiny box in the middle, there is light. And so he transforms back into the raven, grabs the light, and flies out of the chum with it. As he flies out of the chum, Eagle, who has always been, dives down to attack him, and he drops some of the light, and that becomes the moon and the stars. But Raven flies on to the easternmost mountain, where, exhausted, he puts the light down, and that is the great light of the sun. And every day the sun rises in the east, and that's the greatest certainty of all our lives, that the sun will rise tomorrow. And so it does for the Haida and many other Native American groups in northwest coast America. But the wonderful part of the story is at first the old man is very angry with Raven. And then he looks and sees that the girl, his daughter, is beautiful, and he doesn't mind anymore, and life on earth can begin. Light, water, and fire are essential to human life everywhere. And everywhere people use their constantly changing forms as symbols for other worlds, for beliefs, as means of reaching and connecting with supernatural forces. A figure that wonderfully brings together all of these elements is the image of Shiva Nataraja, one of the great symbols of the Hindu traditions. Shiva here is shown dancing, bringing the world into creation. He's surrounded by a ring of fire, which has so many practical and important uses, but also is destructive. In his right hand, he holds up the drum of creation. Around another of his right arms, he has a cobra ready to spit and poison, but his hand is up saying, "Don't be afraid." Under his feet, there is a figure being trampled down. That is ignorance. His hair is flying out to the side, reminiscent of the sacred waters of the Ganges. But Shiva can also destroy. And this constant energy, this constant dancing, which brings the world into existence, which keeps it going, which cuts it down, is a wonderful, wonderful symbol, which is so evocative of the energies of all life, that it's used at the CERN nuclear physics centre in Switzerland as a symbol for how science is trying to understand the subatomic particles that are the very basis of matter. And so outside CERN there is a wonderful sculpture of Shiva Nataraja, the shadow of which at night is cast over the entire building, because this is the energy of the particles, the dance of the particles that make matter and life possible. Many people across the world don't build buildings to go and worship their ancestors or spiritual beings of any kind. For many people, spirits are in all of nature and sometimes even in the objects around them. So many people across the world don't have buildings. And I'm standing beside material that comes from Siberia. And here, hunter-gatherers and herders who live in very temporary camps worship and connect to the spirits through the natural world. Unusually in Siberia, they do make images of their spirits. This is quite rare, but it's common across Siberia. And an example of this is from amongst the Oroki people of southeast Siberia, where they will make images of the spirit of hunting, who always has a dog, because this relationship between human and nature is epitomized, is characterized by the relationship of someone with their dog. And so here we have a lovely little image of a hunting spirit with a reindeer skin lead attached to a wonderful white furry dog who's all bright and inquisitive and has beautiful blue turquoise eyes. Now, the sad thing about these little characters is if they don't bring good luck to the hunt, if things don't go well, this little image will just be abandoned in the great expanse of wilderness that is Siberia. So spirits can be told off for not doing their job. Human beings everywhere have an awful fear of death and great anxieties about how they're going to die and what will happen to them after death. People think about this a lot, and through beliefs they try and overcome those anxieties to make things easier for themselves and for the people around them. So what we have here in the exhibition are lots of examples of how we come to terms with death and how we share our grief in order to get over it through beliefs with other people. In Mexico, the famous festival for the Day of the Dead on the 2nd of November follows on for a very reverent visit to the graves of your loved ones, and you take food and drink and you sit by the grave, you remember the person and the good times, perhaps look at photographs, and you keep vigil through the night. There's then an opportunity to have a bit of a festival, to come together with all the rest of your community, be amongst people who also experience loss and grief, and to have a really extraordinary time dressing up making models, painting your face, having weird hairdos. So really representing worlds and beings beyond nature. And the red devil behind us is one of the figures that comes out regularly for the Day of the Dead. It's made from papier-mâché, and it's a depiction of Judas, who in the biblical story showed the Roman soldiers which member of the group was Jesus Christ, leading to Christ's arrest and crucifixion. So a fascinating character within the biblical story, but of course a betrayer, someone who gave up his friend for 30 pieces of silver. So here depicted with wings and a tail for the devil, a really nasty guy who very often at the end of festivities gets blown up in a great shower of fireworks. It's a huge coming together and a sharing of the fears that we have, depicted in devilish and ghoulish forms, in order to get over what we fear most. It's a conversation with other worlds. Next to it, you can see a much quieter version of the same thing. A very beautiful candle from Jewish practice called a Yahrzeit candle. And the Yahrzeit candle marks the time of the year, the Yahrzeit, year time, the anniversary of the death of your loved one, and the candle is lit and it burns for 24 hours, and it's a very beautiful memorial at the centre of the home and the family, but also now used on Holocaust Memorial Day to mark that solemn occasion. As we've come around the exhibition, we've begun with conversations with worlds beyond our own, which help us to feel safe and to come to terms with ourselves and the meaning of life. We've looked at the way in which we use beliefs to take us through life, from conception to grave and beyond. And now we've come into the last section of the exhibition, where we can reflect for a little bit on what happens when we try and stop believing. And this is the story of this enormous painting behind me, which is in the colours and style of a Russian Orthodox icon, but it was made in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. The beginning of this story goes back 100 years to the revolution. The revolution was very much against the church. The Russian Orthodox Church was seen as part of the Tsarist regime, part of the oppression of the Russian peoples, and what Marx had referred to as religion being the opium of the people, the cry of the oppressed. The communist regimes of the Soviet Union tried to extinguish certainly the power of the church, but gradually also the beliefs of the church. And the icon behind me was painted to try to show to people that communism, that belief in society, community, and secularism could be as powerful as religious rituals and beliefs. And so it shows people getting married, bringing their children, introducing their children to the community and registering the birth, of people standing at the great war memorial in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, without any religious service, but honouring the dead of the two world wars. People contributing to society through producing lots of whatever thing they were manufacturing, being good at school. So they were trying to revitalise the revolution, culturally by saying that you could have this belief in communism without any need to believing in God or to have religious ritual. And it's a really remarkable thing that after 70 years or more of secularism, of not teaching religion, of not allowing people to go to church, of using churches as stores, as cinemas, as community centres, that in such a short span of time, these beliefs can resurge and find such strong focus amongst so many people. And it suggests that you can't deal with beliefs simply by trying to pretend they don't exist. You have to accept that they're part of human nature. They have evolved with us ever since we were fully modern people over 100,000 years ago. And so as we come to the close of the exhibition, the shadow of the Lion Man falls over us again to say, this is where we can see our nature and our behaviour beginning, and you can't just deal with this by trying to shut it off. You have to understand it in order to treat each other well and properly, and that what we share is so much greater than what divides us.
My name's Veronica Strang, and I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I work partly on material culture, but most specifically on material. So my particular interest is in water, and I've been writing about different aspects of water for, I guess it must be over 30 years now. Water, of course, is a lovely topic to work on because you can really go across a whole spectrum, from the kind of crunchy political conflicts over water, issues of water management, water shortages, you know, the whole kind of environmental set of issues that we're all painfully familiar with these days, right through to the more kind of symbolic meanings attached to water and how it takes us into sort of deep cultural ideas about the spirit and how the world works. And then of course there's all the wonderful science of water and its extraordinary properties. So it's a very wide subject in which you can come at it in a lot of different ways. Water beings are a sort of way of understanding the flows of the world, but they also provide a very easily understood metaphor for those kinds of movements of ideas and notions of flow. So, you know, they also contain wisdom. They also talk about the flow of knowledge through the world, as well as water, and if you believe in spiritual things, also the spirit. So they're a good way to conceptualize all of that. So if you go to parts of the world like Australia, they're very beneficent creatures by and large, but they're also extremely dangerous because they also generate ancestral law and they punish people who transgress it. So you get a lot of stories about people being swallowed by them because they've gone to somewhere sacred without proper respect, or they're not supposed to be there, or they're being greedy with fishing, whatever. But generally they are the bringers of life, but they're not soft, they're very powerful. If, on the other hand, you come to this part of the world, it's got more to do with religious transitions from nature religions through to semi-human deities, as in the Greeks and Romans, to more human pantheons, then to monotheisms. And that has to do with humans starting to think more about dominion over the world as they form larger, more hierarchical societies, but more to the point, more instrumental relationships with nature. So your most beneficent water beings are those of the nature religions, where people work in partnership with a non-human and they feel a sense of parity. It's a reciprocal partnership, and you get a real sense of that working in Aboriginal Australia, that the non-human and the sentient landscape is actually a partner with humankind. But when you start to move into societies that bring in agriculture and then irrigation and start forming the landscape a lot more instrumentally, you see a movement in religious thought away from worshipping local water beings and other nature deities into deities who live in places like Olympus, Valhalla, whatever, and then into a far-off heaven. And the closer you get to the big patriarchal religions, the more the serpent beings are demonized, because of course you get that whole period in the medieval world where Christianity was extremely militant in repressing the nature religion. So you get a fluorescence of dragon slayers, and of course you've got some wonderful objects here in the museum, and you're living with God's exhibition. You've got a nice panel with St. George slaying the dragon. You've got a very rare St. George, a black St. George slaying the dragon, and you've got some other nice icons from Russia. So you get this kind of sudden emergence of the saintly heroes slaying the infidel or slaying the serpent, and fundamentally it's the same thing. It's about asserting Christian beliefs and subsuming those pagan nature worshippers. But of course they keep bubbling up, and we still have strong pagan religions in many parts of the world, and indeed in this country, and you still got people having a very important discourse about how we relate to nature. So you get linkages between pagan religious groups, environmental groups, and of course the feminist groups for whom religious patriarchy might be less appealing. Water serpents are fascinating in that on the one hand they're incredibly diverse. They are all shapes and forms and so forth. And they, so I was just talking a little bit about some of the objects you've got here in the museum. You've got that wonderful turquoise Mayan serpent, for example, which is a double-headed, jaguar-headed, it's the most gorgeous object. And then you've got that wonderful Japanese articulated dragon in the Living with Gods exhibition, which is just beautiful. So they're very different. You get them with horns, you get them with plumes, you get them with feathers, you get them with fishy kind of characteristic wolf heads up in the west coast of America, whale-like bodies if you get to the north and Canada. They come in very different forms, and what they tend to do is absorb the forms of their local environment and the local flora and fauna. So there's one theory, for example, that typical rainbow serpents in Australia absorb the pipefish, which has a very dragony type head. And it's but mostly they're snake-like, and the reason that they're snake-like in some form or serpentine is that they represent the properties of water. So on the one hand, they have a lot of things in common. They're serpentine, they are often coloured as water, they move like water, they have the powers of water to generate life and take life. They often have a lot of jaws and teeth and ideas about swallowing and consuming and so forth. And sometimes they're either spitting out humans or they're consuming. And there's that notion of it being something that water can do, like a tsunami swallows whole villages and so forth. So they represent the materiality of water, which is why they have a kind of family resemblance. And at the same time, they pick up local flora and fauna. And that's partly because they are made out of people thinking with water and thinking with local flora and fauna, and partly because in generating the life in the local environment, that's what they're generating: local flora, local fauna, and of course, as we started off talking, human beings as well. So they have a tremendous power in representing not only capacities to generate and take life, but also to connect organic life, because they represent the fact that all organic living kinds depend on water, and in that sense they're all connected by water.
As modern people, we define ourselves by the fact that we think. We're distinguished by the fact that we turn our thoughts into objects, to tools and weapons that give us success, but we also symbolise our thoughts. What do we symbolise? Worlds beyond nature, beings beyond nature. As we turn here, we see Europe in the last ice age. And it shows the human mind developing and asking that question, what does it mean to be here? I'm part of all this nature, but I'm different. I wear clothes and I keep the fire going and I've got tools and weapons. 40,000 years old, it's an extraordinary figure.
It's obviously been handled by a lot of human hands. The top of it, even though it has still maintained a beautiful patina, it's been well worn,
yes.
And that must be to do with human contact. That can't
yes.
just be because of its preservation
yes.
in the ground. The more intimate they're with the object, I assume that means they're going to be closer to the spirit of the object.
Yes. The fascinating thing is in the mouth area there are signs of organic material that suggest it might also have been fed. So they've talked to it. It's been part of rituals.
It's been nurtured.
And it's been nurtured.
Nurtured by humanity. And what's interesting, though, is when you look at it, it does have a great sense of sort of timelessness, of infinity.
Well, of course, the start of all creation stories is light.
This is a beautiful piece. The colors, the way it's been done almost looks like something that's very modern.
A religion of ancient Persia, and the first faith that we know of to have one God, the concept of just one deity. God, Ahura Mazda, is represented by the eternal flame of the fire.
So the iconography of fire.
Well, it's something which has always been there. Of course, in the period of the Lion Man, keeping the fire going was a vital activity because you needed the warmth, you needed to cook, you needed protection from wild animals. So the fire becomes the focal point of human activities very, very early on. Here we look at the Jewish rituals of the Sabbath.
This is obviously 2017, and these are objects that are used today during the traditional service of lighting candles.
This is about how we worship, how we believe, and that we believe. It's not so much focused on what we believe, because when you look at how we believe, we find that we share so much more than what divides us. The universal interest in fire, in water, in candles, and all of these things unites us. It shows that we have a shared base, and for me there's some hope in that. This is a limestone sculpture from Giza, which is now modern Iraq.
It has a sense of patience in terms of her prayer and a great sense of humility. And if you look at, I think, all of the broader group of religions that you've presented here, patience and humility are two key elements. That's why I think this is one of my favorite pieces here.
So here we look at the many ways in which we focus our prayers through beads. They begin in Buddhism, spread out across Asia, as far as Japan, spread out into Europe, into Christianity, come back into Islam. Of course, humans have this awareness and anxiety over death. We find so many ways in which to make death better. In West Africa, the funeral service is very, very elaborate, and the coming together is very, very useful for the community.
I adore St. Joseph, and St. Joseph is about having a good death. This illustrates the fact that many cultures see death as a continuation of life, but just in a different form.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think that across the world and through many faiths, this kind of ritual we all share.
I've got to stop you here just because I find this to be one of the most dramatic pieces, because it deals with this whole notion of conflict in religion, the actual object itself forcing a priest to put their foot on the crucifix, almost making worse the suffering of Christ.
It's extraordinary to make an art object which is for abuse. And you can see here the Inquisition, this process of people being asked to stamp on this thing, knowing that if you were a Christian, this is something you just could not do. but also knowing that if they didn't stamp on this image, then their families and they would suffer.
And you have this very extraordinary, almost sensationalized notion that the Russian government is trying to hijack the Christian
Yes.
faith here.
This is a regime that has refused religion, and yet they're realising in 1985 this is painted, that they're losing it, that people have to have rituals, they have to have a belief. So they try and say, well, your belief needs to be in the socialist state.
No,
and it
wasn't-
shows you
But it
getting...
wasn't deep enough.
No.
These are all simple, material
Yes.
things, which is not enough. You have to sort of search for the deeper meaning. It's interesting, and this wonderful.
And then this, of course, is scientific atheism. This is
Yes.
a cosmonaut walking in space saying, I see no God, and the church falling underneath.
And I love it how he's almost like an angel.
Yes.
You have him presented flying
Yeah.
above a
Yeah.
very traditional Russian icon. I think one of my other favorite objects, this Lampedusa cross, is 2014, very beautiful, but the tragedy underlying it is very powerful.
Yes, this was the terrible sinking of a ship with a huge number of lives lost. Francesco Tuccio, he met Eritrean and Somali Christians in his church who were survivors, but he didn't know what to do with them. He was not a wealthy man, he had no resources, he didn't know what he could give. So he gave what he could, which was from the wood of the ships.
As we leave the Lampedusa cross, I can't help but see over my left shoulder our starting point with the Lion Man, and how the more and more I walk through and experience the energy of this exhibition, the more I realize I'm never going to forget the Lion Man.
We haven't changed very much in 40,000 years. What we need and to whom we speak are the same thing.
And we need to respect each other's dignity
Yes.
and the human factor.
Very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
When you ask people to reflect on their own inner experience, what's going on in their head as they're walking to work or lying in the bath or chopping vegetables in the kitchen, people tend to report there's an awful lot of language. People tend to say that they talk to themselves a lot, silently in their head as they're going about their business. So as a psychologist, I'm interested in where these internal voices come from, what they're doing there, what are their functions, and what is it like to have these experiences. And in the more recent part of my career, I've been interested in a more unusual phenomenon, that of hearing voices, or to use its medical term, auditory verbal hallucinations. So I and my colleagues at Durham figured that what we should try to do is look at the experience from lots of different perspectives, lots of different academic disciplines. So we don't just have the psychologists and the neuroscientists, we have theologians, we have philosophers, we have medieval historians and literary scholars, and so on. And we're trying to understand this experience from as broad a range of perspectives as possible. And that becomes really interesting. So one of the things that struck me quite early on in this research was the need to take a richer, broader view of it than would typically be the case in psychology and neuroscience. I mean, we could reduce these experiences to events in the brain, but we'd lose pretty much all of their meaning and significance. These are experiences that mean things to people. They can mean things in a negative way. They can be very frightening, very troublesome, very distressing experiences, but they can also be very positive. They exist across cultures and across historical periods, and they've been interpreted differently in different periods of history as well. From my point of view, one of the most interesting historical case studies has been that of the early 15th century mystic Marjorie Kemp, who wrote an extraordinary book. It's known as the Book of Marjorie Kemp. And she should be better known, to be honest, because she wrote the first book in the English language that can be considered an autobiography. She was the first person to write about her own life in English, which makes her a literary giant just for that reason. She was an extraordinary character. She was a mother of 14. She'd failed as a businesswoman twice. Sometime around the birth of her first child, she started to have voices and visions, which she interpreted in a spiritual and a religious framework. And then later in life, she had further revelations which led her to dedicate herself to telling the world about her experiences. So she would go and knock on the doors of princes and bishops. She'd dress all in white. She'd command attention, ask people to listen to her stories of her experiences. It was a very risky thing to do. And we have rich, vivid accounts of what her experiences were like. So in her earliest experience, she wakes up from asleep and she sees this figure sitting at the end of her bed. And the figure is dressed in a purple cloak, and he says to her, "Daughter, why have you forsaken me when I never forsook you?" It's Jesus Christ. She sees Christ sitting at the end of her bed. But her experiences, they can be very clearly auditory. She talks about hearing the voice of God as clearly as if there'd been another person in the room with her. But she also writes about experiences that don't fit so neatly into the idea of hearing voices as this kind of intoning voice, this kind of commanding voice. So for example, she talks about hearing this sort of rustling sound, which she takes to be the sound of the Holy Spirit, comparing it to a pair of bellows, the things that you would pump a fire up with. Another time she hears the Holy Spirit as the voice of a robin redbreast. So it becomes the voice of a bird, or in another occasion, the voice of a dove. So she has this range of experiences, these diverse, rich, complex experiences. They go with visual sensations, they go with bodily sensations. Experiences like Marjorie's are meaningful. They're meaningful in all sorts of different ways, and those meanings are constructed in different ways by different people at different times. By looking into the past, we can see some of those processes of meaning-making in action. We can see them in the context, the social and the religious and the cultural contexts in which they emerge. The idea that Marjorie's experiences were a kind of internal dialogue is really liberating. It's helped me to rethink my own sort of cognitive psychology model of how these things work. But it gives us a different way of thinking about prayer as well, and of spiritual meditation. The idea that Marjorie is having a conversation with a beloved figure that she's sort of internalized and that she carries around with her. Sometimes that conversation is a very condensed inner dialogue where she's very close to the figure, that it's a sense of being with her God, a kind of different way of thinking about spiritual meditation. At other times, the dialogue is more what I would call expanded. So it has more of the to and fro conversational quality of a dialogue. And that's the point at which Marjorie hears God speaking to her as an external voice. So this has been really influential for me, for my thinking. And it helps us to think differently about what prayer is and how it works and the different ways in which somebody can seek comfort and solace from being with a spiritual entity.